Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Berry. I'm the director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA, and it's my great pleasure to invite everyone to today's lecture, which will feature Tina Lu from Yale University. Here at the Center for Chinese Studies, normally our programming is during the academic year, and even though it's summer, since we're all in quarantine, we're all hunkered down at home, we thought we would try to continue some programming over the summer as a way to maintain community and bring people together. Moving forward, we're going to be continuing with a variety of events, including teach-ins, artist talks, scholarly talks, and I think it's really important we do our best to try to bring people together during these very difficult times in whatever way we can. As part of that, at the end of the talk today, I thought after I hit the record button and we turn off the recording, for those who are interested, since I see we have a lot of specialists from Chinese studies from all around the country, maybe even the world here, it'd be nice to just have a virtual hang session. And so I'll just leave the Zoom open a little bit so those people who want to reconnect and socialize can do so. And so after the talk, if you are not pressed for time, feel free to hang around a little bit to speak with the speaker and other guests. But without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague, Professor Yinghui Wu from UCLA, who is a specialist in late imperial Chinese literature, and she will be introducing our speaker today. Yinghui.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I can see that actually we have a larger audience than we normally have when we hold these talks on site. So it's a very exciting occasion for me because I've been self-isolating for 5 months, and now I'm kind of longing for some intellectual conversation in the academic community. And I feel everybody is feeling the same. So since we have a big international audience, I think Tina, I will do a proper introduction still. So hello everybody, welcome to this room talk hosted by the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. And so today our speaker is Tina Lu. Professor Tina Lu is Colonel John Trumbull, Professor of East Asian Languages and Literatures at Yale. Her research focuses on literature of the late imperial period, late imperial China, and she is author of numerous publications. The major ones include Persons, Roles, and Minds, and also Accidental Incest, Filial Cannibalism, and Other Peculiar Encounters in Late Imperial Chinese Literature, and also a chapter in a Cambridge History of Chinese Literature, and a co-edited volume on approaches to teaching the story of the stone. I should also note that her new book, titled The Coin and the Severed Head, Ownership and Fungibility in 17th Century China, is forthcoming from Harvard East Asia Center. The other projects Professor Lu is working on include a collaborative project on the 17th century playwright and painter Xu Wei, and also she's working on a major digital project called the 10,000 Rooms, which is a collaborative platform for people to share primary sources and annotations and commentaries. Today, without much ado, I shall introduce the topic of Tina's talk today. The topic is Zhang Dai and the Aesthetics of Slavery. So let's welcome Tina.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Yinghui. Thank you, Esther. Thank you for making this happen and at such short notice. I was born when my parents were students at UCLA, so I always think of UCLA as like my fundamental home institution. I also just want to apologize in advance, first for grotesque errors that will be memorialized forever, because of my own failings, and also because, like all of you, I've been without a library for 5 months. But also my apologies for any hiccups with Zoom, because I'm also still a relative newbie. So for years, I've been working on this book on the thing in the 17th century and how different genres make arguments about what can be owned and what can't, about fungibility and about value. And I was planning on writing a conclusion in the spring of 2020. And, you know, things look very different now than they did 6 months ago. So what you're about to hear is a sinologist version of the reevaluation and introspection that's been taking place all around us. I'm very much workshopping these ideas, and I so appreciate any help that you can offer. So please feel free to talk to me after the talk or to email me. So my manuscript as a whole engages with Karl Marx's idea of commodity fetishism. So namely that focusing attention on things is a way to hide the social relations that produce those things. So the phantasmagorical that he's talking about here refers to a kind of performance that used magic lanterns to project fantastic images that 18th century European viewers thought were real. Now, famously, Walter Benjamin assigned even more power to the phantasmagoria, arguing that the entire culture of commodity-producing society could be seen in its whole as this elaborate illusion, this phantasmagoria. And in fact, after chapters on ownership, my manuscript does take on the pervasive 17th century interest in surfaces and optical illusions. So today I am talking about Taoan mengyi, a collection of essays by the 17th century writer Zhang Dai, who was born into a wealthy Shaoxing family. These essays are reminiscences of his life under the Ming Dynasty before the conquest of the Qing upended his life. And their stylistic flair and gorgeousness have dazzled critics and readers for generations. But I want to argue that that same stylistic flair really demands consideration as a social position, and that the engagement with the object world is deeply political. So I should say that my husband read an earlier version of this talk and said nicely, "Isn't this kind of obvious?" And so, like, in some ways, what I'm talking about today is how this is obvious, that aestheticism, of course, is classism. But why couldn't I see this for the last 30 years? The short answer is that our field, and when I say our field, I mean in the Chinese-speaking world and outside of it, relentlessly identifies with the interests of the ruling class, with slave owners rather than enslaved people. And in fact, I would say that the most difficult aspect of my engagement with 17th century texts has always been, how do you take as seriously as possible their experience of the world without accepting it? And in fact, the way in which Zhang Dai treats a triangle of relationships, the thing, the self, the social world, brings into focus a whole range of things about 17th century society that modern readers don't find particularly palatable. Acceptance of social rank and hierarchy, and also, of course, transacting people to perform sexual and other forms of labor. Now, among other things, this book, Taoan mengyi, is a snapshot of a social world, but it is one to which we modern readers have a small and necessary claim. He appeals to us because we are presumed to share the same aesthetic values as he does. Now, in fact, identifying with Zhang Dai's aesthetics lies behind much of the modern scholarship on Zhang Dai that celebrates the writing and its evocation of a rich sensory world. It's almost as if the book makes a proposition that through its descriptions of what was heard, tasted, and above all seen, it will allow a reader to step into Zhang Dai's shoes to experience what he did. So Zhang Dai asks us to accept a phenomenological understanding of memory, that memory is sense, that dream and memory are synonymous. In other words, he's really presenting an invitation to a social interaction. In literary settings, we call this kind of invitation genre. Here's Carolyn Miller's definition of what genre does. Now, Miller's version of genre replaces traditional sinological understanding of genre that categorizes texts according to their languages, their themes, and their histories of textual transmission. And instead, she proposes that any text can be seen as a social compact that resolves a social problem. And what is that social problem in the case of Taoan mengyi? These essays, Zhang Dai proposes to us, are transparent reminiscences. Now, it's a sign of our acceptance of that proposal that Zhang Dai is routinely classified as a Ming writer, even though his life was cut in two by the dynastic fall, and the writing for which he is known was produced decades into the Qing dynasty. Now, this fact is not merely a matter of dating, because we're being asked to maintain two contradictory positions. On the one hand, he asks us to agree that the memories are records of sensation. And on the other hand, he can only describe this lifestyle of wealth and splendor under the cover of regrets for the past. So you all know there's a famous preface that is all about how much he regrets all the enjoyments of the past. So the text at once occupies a space of immediate presence and absence. And the reasons we accept this proposal have everything to do with the taboos and imperatives of elite culture that dictate what a person can say and what they can't say. So let's just recognize that we're in the terrain of manners when we're reading Taoan mengyi. So let's look a little bit at this invitation. This is what we agree to when we accept it. So Zhang Dai writes about a famous Nanjing prostitute, Wang Yueshen, and he combines a stylized description of this young woman with a narrative in which she slights a customer. Now, to borrow Miller's question, what social action is achieved by this aesthetic? Partly what is achieved is the silencing of whole spheres and the interiority of Yueshen. So other texts close to this one in time approach elite courtesans very differently. So this is a vernacular story, very famous, I'm sure all of you have read it, in which the oil seller falls in love with the courtesan Mingyang. Mingyang is like Yueshen in that she also is talented in all sorts of elite arts, and she too is forced to consort with men she can't stand. But here the reader gets a very different picture. So a rich young man, Ba Gongzi, who's a lot like the Gongzi in the Yueshen anecdote, tries to gain Mingyang's favor. She refuses. He and his goons drag her onto his boat and then humiliate her. Now, nothing that happens to Mingyang would have been regarded as a crime by late imperial courts. Nonetheless, the details force us to sympathize with her and not to the rapist. Now, in many respects, hold on, this is where you're going to see that I'm a newbie with the whole routine. Okay. Now, in many respects, this difference between the vernacular story and the classical essay shows us in negative outline what the classical essay regards as unseemly, what you shouldn't say. That is also its ongoing power. Now, Jameson tells us that genres are literary institutions whose function is to specify the proper use of a particular cultural artifact. These two texts are different social gatherings, admitting different kinds of interactions. So we are meant to read, here we go. We are meant to read Zhang Dai's description of Wang Yueshen and admire both her beauty and her ability to retain purity while working as a sex worker. We are not meant to read this and ask whether the man who is paid for Yueshen's 2 weeks, she slept and ate with him for half a month, is also raping her. How frequently was he raping her? Did she fight the way that Mingyang did? Who earns the money that the rich young man paid to rape Yue Shen? Such questions violate the social norms which ground this literary act. So I just want you to see that these norms are not neutral. They withhold flesh and agency from Wang Yueshen, and in return for being admitted to Zhang Dai's circle, for his treating us as a fellow, wealthy, male elite of refinement and taste, we agree to be silent on the realm of the material and the bodily, except for that of sight. Now, even across 3.5 centuries, I feel two conflicting things about this. So first of all, it makes me a little uncomfortably complicit in the rape of Wang Yueshen. And second of all, in pointing that out, I feel like a rude American woman overstepping herself in a party that I should be lucky to have been invited to in the first place. But I think the kind of key thing here is I want you to see that Zhang Dai needs us to make this essay work. When he writes with admiration about her refusal to speak to her purchaser, Zhang Dai transforms this exchange into something that he needs us to agree is beautiful. In other words, the reader's consent and approval is necessary, and you might even say it stands in for Yue Shen's herself. I think you probably also have noticed that Zhang Dai himself is hiding. And someone might ask, what was Zhang Dai's own place in her life? How has he come to know her so well? Was he one of her lovers? Did he also rape her? These essays collectively are both about the transformation of social and economic power into something pleasurable, because everything wonderful that can be bought makes its appearance in their pages. But these essays also stand in for that transformation. I'm gonna stop sharing for one moment so you can see my face. To turn money into something beautiful, a 17th century man could buy art or eat something delicious or put on a play, or he could write about the purchase of art or food or the putting on of a play. And what I'm going to be talking about today is something that the essays cannot help but reveal, which is that many and maybe all 17th century pleasures, including writing, involved control over other people, some of them impossible to enjoy outside of the framework of owning another human being. And that there's no way for a reader, even 3.5 centuries later, to separate cleanly the aesthetic, what makes these essays beautiful, from Zhang Dai's absolute control over human beings purchased for his pleasure. The aesthetic itself hinges on that control. So I'm not going to be talking about the ways in which sinologists all over the world continue to abet that social world, but they do. And maybe we can talk about that afterwards. Okay, I'm going back to screen share. Hold on. Am I in screen share?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on. I should not have done that. Hold on. Okay, hold on. See, I'm not good enough at this yet to like try to do anything fancy. Hold on. Am I in screen share now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Now, one of the things that you notice when you read these essays is that Zhang Dai is particularly drawn to lavish tableau. So here are two of them that admire spectacle that upends normal perception. Special effects can also be found on a small scale, as in this party, in Sea of Chrysanthemums. Zhang Dai describes a carefully manicured garden with flowers grown at different tiers, And the scene culminates in a stage-crafted party with representations and chrysanthemums no longer distinguished at all. And the point, I think, was to overwhelm the senses so that the reader, the viewer, was rendered incapable of distinguishing layers of representation. And you can see that this is recapitulated in the classical Chinese itself. Now, this is how Zhang Dai accounts for this spectacular effect. Now, I suspect that if I had been at this party, I would probably have accounted for this effect by gardeners. And Zhang Dai's tripartite explanation hews to certain rhetorical imperatives. He is the aesthete who leaves room for mystery and art. But in so doing, he also draws the curtain over labor. So here is another version of the same effect. So he describes this wonderful crab party with a parade of side dishes that accompany the crab. Duck confit, cow's milk yogurt, wine-soaked clams, cabbage cooked in duck fat, tangerines, chestnuts, caltrops, freshly harvested rice, and of course his own famous snow orchid tea. And he summarizes the meal this way. Now, I again would argue that there's nothing particularly divine about these foods, only the labor involved in boiling crabs a la minute, and for the rest, cost and labor. And one wonders how many people's labor is erased and turned into something effortless and magical here, a banquet for the gods. This is part of a larger pattern. An aficionado like Zhang Dai finds himself in an odd position in writing about the labor involved in producing these overwhelming effects, and it's crystallized in modifiers like divine and ghostly, tian and gui. So even if laborers are erased, their presence demands to be accounted for, whether as in Heavenly Kitchen or the power of terroir. So here is another example. Once again, this essay suggests the complicated position that Zhang Dai assigns to labor. Now, on the one hand, the goal of all of these crafts, and the essays cover many of them. They're an odd bag of lanterns and fireworks and stage productions and flower displays and crab dinners, is to overpower explanatory mechanism. You cannot tell anymore how this has happened. The viewers are stunned, incapable of understanding what they have seen. On the other hand, if privileged knowledge is what makes viewers, writers, connoisseurs, the sum total of Zhang Dai's expertise is command and purchase. So from beginning to end, this essay, The Lanterns of Shimei Tang, concerns Zhang Dai's relationship to all the labor that he has gotten a chance to commission and command. And it consists partly, at least, of human beings that he and his family have control over. So his history with lanterns is also his history with labor. So here's the beginning. Tang Tou are figures who recur in these essays. They're manservants who are elderly, who are probably enslaved. So his first experience with lanterns takes place literally on the body of a bondsman. And the essay continues in like fashion. After Zhang Dai explains that lanterns and theatrical performances enhance each other, he describes the ne plus ultra of experiences where he is surrounded by his lavish lantern collection, fireworks, and a performance by his private acting troupe, or jiaban, whose members are probably owned by his family. And Zhang Dai here celebrates his own absolute artistic control. Now, in between these two moments in this essay, he provides an enormous amount of social context for his lantern collection and how many people were involved in its creation. Critics have pointed out how much Zhang Dai knows about lanterns. I would argue his knowledge is very specific. So he knows what someone like Sha Erjing does, but not how. So this reference to Tiangong again, both praises and obfuscates the labor. It's fundamentally a position to be assumed only by mastery over the laborer. So terms like this denote the distance, precise distance between slave and master, between command and work. Now, in this essay, probably more than anywhere else in the collection, the construction of an all-consuming spectacle in a social world of workmen and slaves cannot be disaggregated. Similarly, the Wagnerian opera, the original Gesamtkunstwerk, in gathering together the labor of hundreds to create a single effect under the control of a single impresario, has been adored by authoritarian states. So each opera is a way of celebrating the subjugation of hundreds, orchestra, singers, set designers, lighting experts, artists, to a single mind. Again, it was all in the arrangement of the master. But of course, at the same time, Guigong, the real art remains elusive, performed by someone else, executed by someone else, maintained by someone else. Even if no other person could have achieved these heights, the magic always seems liable to retreat to another layer, to turn into inhuman skill. I wonder which of these two is the primary phenomenon, which the chicken and which the egg. One of the collection's most celebrated passages concerns the light display at the Lufiefdom, a beautifully articulated version of a fully immersive aesthetic experience. Now, perhaps the effect that he seeks of sensation that overpowers all context, that emerges out of the fundamental condition of master, of someone whose distance from the illusion and consequent enjoyment is precisely that which marks the distinction in status. So he is watching while they work, watching the what in the absence of the how is the defining experience of the master. So does the supreme ideal of art as stunning, as defined context, as defined context, arise fully from its production by servants and slaves whose labor cannot be fully seen? Certainly from our distance, we cannot approach the aesthetic separately from its means of production. They are the same. So Zhang Dai's circumstances as aesthete and owner, where the two are inseparable, are foundational to his subjectivity. Hegel famously considered how a master and a slave might define themselves against each other. Scholars still debate whether the master-slave dialectic should be understood literally or metaphorically. Is it a struggle between two people at a time and place where obviously relations of servitude were commonplace, or is it a condition between two realms of consciousness? The key in either case is that each defines the other. So here's Jameson again, summarizing the place of the master as he is constituted by the slave. And I must say, I find this version of Zhang Dai's persistent dream metaphor far more compelling than Kafalas's explanation of dream as a particular and unexpectedly powerful mode of remembering. Dream, surface, spectacle, all of these are defined against labor. So this is what happens to a subjectivity that's defined by Jameson's luxury of a placeless freedom. So in this essay, Zhang Dai takes a long solitary trip into a white-on-white snowscape. It's from 1626 in the heart of the Little Ice Age. And he goes on this excursion and encounters another rich gentleman, also enjoying a drink, also having dragged a retinue of servants into the middle of this snowscape. This stranger from Nanjing interrupts Zhang Dai's own perfect tableau, but Zhang Dai has done the same to him. And when the doppelganger says, "In the middle of this lake, how can there be another person?" we cannot tell whether Zhang Dai is voicing the stranger's sentiment or the other way around, because each imagines the other as part of this all-white visual landscape. So this is what happens to the looker. Now, I want to return I want you to recall the Sea of Chrysanthemums, where there was tremendous pleasure in the confusion between three-dimensional display and two-dimensional display. And this pattern recurs elsewhere as well. In water margin cards, Zhang Dai praises playing cards painted by his friend, the celebrated artist Chen Hongshou. And he claims that characters appear to pop out of the flat card. Now, both flowers and cards are adjacent to tableaux that treat actual living people this way, as a component of visual effects. So there is a topos of perfect casting behind both Chrysanthemum Party and Water Margin playing cards. And the idea is that an actor might so completely resemble his role that he seems to pop out of a two-dimensional field. Now, of course, what differentiates perfect casting from a flower display is that in the case of perfect casting, the medium are actual human beings. So in some ways, perfect casting foregrounds the social gradient. Its pleasures are the pleasures of command and control. So this essay is about a wealthy family that spares no expense at casting. And once villagers are cast and lavishly costumed, their original identities are effaced entirely. The pleasure for the viewers here is not dissimilar to that enjoyed by the card players or guests at the Chrysanthemum Party. This is all about representation and original blurred together in ways that are impossible to separate. In the case of casting, though, the impact has to do with total social control. Now, in considering Zhang Dai's relationship to those who perform his labor, I've done my best to avoid relying on the word slavery as an explanatory mechanism, other than cheating a little bit and using it in the title of this paper, and I recognize that. Partly because I know that in English, slavery evokes first a specific economic history, a very distinctly transatlantic combination of racism and global capitalism, but also the Anglo-American political discourse that emerged from it, in which the deployment of this word cannot be separated from its opposites, freedom and liberty. What I want to stress is that by the standards of the 17th and 18th, by our standards, no 17th century Chinese person was free, or rather, almost all were available under some circumstance to be transacted. Scholars of early modern China are currently engaged in a heated discussion as to how we can separate the Ming and Qing practices of human trafficking when they were so widespread as to be constitutive of all of society. Can we consider all women to be trafficked or subject to trafficking, where marriage is a legitimated act of trafficking? Does the traditional Chinese family mean that radical transactionality governed everyone's identities? What does it mean that people can sell themselves and that option was open to men? Open to men because women, of course, were always being transacted by others. Radical transactionality permeated every corner of 17th century society. And yet, the genres that we read are governed by social compacts that make the direct outlines of this trait in people almost impossible to see. These genres themselves constitute class identity. They are complicit with ruling class interests. Now, perhaps we're best off understanding 17th century slavery in grayscale, infinite shades of hierarchy that descend down to absolute servitude instead of binary states. So take this man who depicts Hulian, who was paid handsomely, Zhang Dai tells us. He lives in a world in which some people can sell themselves, and both his total effacement of identity and its aesthetic pleasures must be understood within that context. And I think it's critical to understand in these hierarchical games that one person's loss of agency comes at the hands of another. As far as agency is concerned, this is a zero-sum game with loss directly going to another's gain. And it's also rarely a one-on-one relationship. The real pleasures of the tableau involve not only all the other participants losing all vestige of self-determination, but also on the massive scale of human ownership. So consider again Zhang Dai's pride in his lantern display at the end of this essay, when he celebrates artistic control far in excess of that available to an individual. The ratio of artist, who is also impresario, who is also owner, to those who enable the vision is, I don't know, 1 to 20, 1 to 40, 1 to hundreds. Okay, probably someone is saying, but Zhang Dai is famous for pointing out low status people. What about Liu Jingting, the pockmarked singer? And in fact, low status people make a number of appearances in these essays. Many people have pointed out that social mixing is implicit in the 17th century theater, with elite impresarios and actors who otherwise occupied opposite ends of the social spectrum sharing the stage. But let's take a look at when Zhang Dai actually writes about low status people. Even the most superficially egalitarian of gestures is grounded on an understanding of status that is zero-sum. So elevating one person must mean degrading another. So take this essay. The point in elevating these particular men is not to erase status difference. Instead, this essay is grounded on not just grounded on an understanding of hierarchy. It enacts an understanding of hierarchy. It describes, it creates new boundaries. So by citing people who debase themselves, the essay reconstitutes the line between true social equals and those who deserve their conditions of subservience. But even more the case, the mixing of status in this world with its extremes of inequality is not neutral. Every tableau, whether artificial or natural in the volume, bears the marks of social control. The essay Unmoored Garden describes an excursion to the gardens at which elites and their social inferiors mingle. The first 5 are elites, the last 3 are professional entertainers. You can imagine this one as a painting by, again, the friend Chen Hongshou, as an idealized version of elite leisure. And though an important part of the mise-en-scène, the performers are cast here just as much as the man who played Hulian. So here, as well as elsewhere, stage aesthetics permeate the essays. They set up the writer's subjective position. So here we go. And I want to point out that even in essays that nominally have nothing to do with the stage, you can see the traces of stage aesthetics. So here's one of the collection's most famous essays, which is about Yangzhou's red light district, and it describes a lighting effect. The resemblance to other essays about lighting effects is not incidental. Moreover, just as the spectator remains detached from action on stage, Zhang Dai's own position in this Yangzhou red light district remains unspoken. We assume that his neutrality means that he is a John, but he does not tell us that. So This essay describes the sexual trafficking of young girls in Yangzhou. And I want us to notice the way in which his subjectivity here is fully absorbed by the position of spectatorship. So seeing and commodification are clearly closely related to one another. This is all about how the girls are paraded one by one in front of a discerning buyer. Now, noticeably, Zhang Dai never places himself in the scene except as an eye exhausted by how many girls there are. So many girls. Elsewhere in Chinese literature, white faces and red shirts might be synecdoche for a beautiful girl, but here they're girls reduced to what can be seen, just as earlier they are face, hands, skin, eyes. The lens of commodification that transforms them into surface does not limit its impact to those who are seen. It also creates the kind of subject who describes them, Zhang Dai himself. So he continues with this interesting comparison. The eye insists on treating the girl who was purchased for sexual purposes with as much detachment as a word that falls apart and loses meaning. It's almost as if the random brushstrokes are like the bits of visual stimulus that the girl herself has turned into. White faces, red shirts, brushstrokes, all stimuli alike in their illegibility. Reduced to pure eye, Zhang Dai is also himself stripped of context and involvement, and even of interiority. It's interesting to note that Zhang Dai's near contemporary Li Yu also wrote about buying a girl in Yangzhou, and he positions himself very differently. So Li Yu's essay is also about how hard it is to pick out the right one. Li Yu situates himself precisely in his position of the market, accounting for his own objective remove. So he is a lower rank hanger-on, offering consumer wisdom to the actual buyer. So in other words, he can write about his lack of desire because he's not buying for himself. In contrast, Zhang Dai places himself nowhere in this scene. He offers up only silence in any effort to situate him. So that fundamentally, this scene of consumerist desire, because, why are you buying a girl if not for desire, is turned into an interaction that is stripped of all personal stake. So there's a way in which the aesthetic eye and the commodified girls exist in a dyad. They're each generating each other. They are bits of stimulus. He is an eye. Whoops. In reading the essay, in enjoying the bits of stimulus revealed to us, we take up his position. We see through his eye. But let me consider what is closed to us in the process. We also remain in the dark about a whole host of other questions. Zhang Dai, are you buying this girl for yourself? Which girl did you end up buying? How many times have you bought a girl this way? Did it work out well? Did you like her? These are all questions that are foreclosed to us because he is turned into this pure eye. But I think even worse, he creates this position in which neither he nor we can really theorize this action. So I want to extend this phenomena further than the Skinny Horses of Yangzhou. Skinny Horses is the only essay in the collection which explicitly treats trafficking. I want to think about how the focus on surface is foundational to 17th century aesthetics. So any of you who study the 17th century certainly have noticed it. It's grounded in radical inequality in the stage. So a beautiful surface, focusing on the surface, stands in for social control. Beautiful surfaces are sometimes created by social control. Writing about beautiful surfaces is addressed to the class of people who in their enslaving of others desire social control. how else can we understand the status of actors in the Zhang family troops, in which Zhang Dai reflects on several generations of his family's private drama troops? The essay links the aesthetics of the stage and of servitude. So he first traces the family's long history of drama appreciation. He starts with his grandfather's friends and social equals, all of them holders of the Jingshi degree. And then he produces this list. These are the names of the troops the family has owned, as well as the actors who belong to these troops. Then Zhang Dai marvels at the passage of time, marked by the 5 different troops. Now, from the perspective of the enslaved, what this line actually means is that the individuals that were listed grew old, they were disposed of, they died, and they were replaced by younger versions. But what he presents with us here is the perspective of the owner, which is the perspective of the surface, where what is on stage grows old, then young, again and again, replaced, discarded, replaced, discarded. The eye sees only surface. Creepily enough, this line could almost cover how I consider the 5 laptops that Yale has bought for me. Zhang Dai's explanation of how it looks to the eye makes clear that 2 related aesthetics are actually one. First, that of perfect casting, and second, that of the surface, the chrysanthemums that fill the scope of vision, the playing card. The conclusion, which reflects on his own aging, takes the next step and equates visuality with the ownership of other humans. He's literally an eye. Now, in trying to understand their world, in trying to put myself in their shoes, I hit an obstacle. To us, a world in which human beings are trafficked and sold is unacceptable. To them, the opposite is true. A world in which other human beings were not transacted is impossible to imagine. Owning people grounds everything. Historians like Matthew Sommer and Joanna Ransmeyer imply that these were the fundamental conditions of the late imperial family and thus of society as a whole. Sommer and Ransmeyer uses sources that are 18th century and later, but the gist of their conclusions hold for the 17th century. But of all spaces, the stage, and specifically the stage on which a family troupe performed, was the ultimate arena for control over other human beings. The enslaved actors are told what to wear, what to say, how to look, every detail of their surface controlled, every detail of their personal habitus, how to talk, how to sing, how to breathe. A display case for the way in which one person can take total autonomy from another. So one of the villains of Tao Hua Shan, Kong Shangren's play, Peach Blossom Fan, the real-life Ran Dachen, here called Ran Yuanhai, was a celebrated playwright whose family troupes were famous as a site of artistic production and control that has probably only rarely been replicated in world history. Zhang Dai praises Ran Dachen's troops in these terms. This is total control. This is a valorization of owning other people. This turns owning other people into something beautiful. And these are the plays that I have been studying for my entire adult life. You're probably pretty bored with me by this point. You're probably thinking that if essays that are about Jaban or the trafficking of girls or flower shows bother me this much, I should probably just steer myself to other topics, or maybe even to other writers. A longer version of this paper involved more of a scavenger hunt to recoup some identity to the scores of enslaved people who leave some trace in the essays. But my point is that there is no escape. The charms of Taoan mengyi as a whole are shaped by radical inequality. The same holds for the volumes Zhang Dai voice, and I fear it holds for 17th century literature as a whole. There is no Zhang Dai who is not an owner of other human beings. Let me end with a final essay about a famous courtesan, Zhu Chushen, that concludes with a beautiful scene of her weeping as the sun sets behind her. We're invited to appreciate the constructed tableau of an attractive woman weeping on a bridge at sunset, even as we can understand the place of neither Zhang Dai nor Zhu Chushen in this scene that he's constructed. So we read this, we cannot tell whether she was Zhang Dai's lover. We cannot tell whether her tears have anything to do with him. We cannot tell whether he was the ultimate cause of the sorrow that killed her. But that's not the worst of it. Obviously, we are meant to read her sorrow and find it beautiful. And fundamentally, we cannot tell whether Zhang Dai's interactions with this tableau arise out of his role as a fellow human being or as an impresario. So when he writes, I asked her what was the matter, she put me off, no aspect of his positionality is known to us, whether he is relating a lover's quarrel in which he is a participant, or whether he is a curator of a precious scene. So the conditions that construct their relationship as a transacted person shape how we and he see this scene as an aesthetically appealing surface. But let us also recognize that these circumstances shape precisely what lyric prose can and cannot say. Outside of this social context, there's no aesthetic of the surface, no Zhang Dai, no classical language vignette. If you are still listening, I thank you for your patience. I know that Zoom talks are not easy to listen to, and I assume that you are like me. You're someone with an investment in this literature and in pre-modern Chinese culture. You're someone who cares. I've made the argument that Southern drama itself, the pinnacle of whose performance were family troupes, is in the 17th century nothing more or less than the medium of slave owning. In other words, I have yucked our collective yum. I'm going to leave you with this. I am committed in my practice as a reader, in all the time that is left to me, to be ruder to my 17th century hosts. That I recognize that as a reader, as a teacher, as a modern, as a woman, there is moral imperative to clarify our critical positions that run against the grain of this literature itself. That we have to recognize that enjoying this literature comes at cost. We are not 17th century slaveholders, and we should be suspicious of their overtures to us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Tina. We really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and reflections and very recent research with us. At this point, I want to turn the screen back over to Yinghui, who will offer some reflections and a few questions to get our discussion going.
Are we back in the mode?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Tina, for your very intriguing talk. I think it's very fresh perspective on Zhang Dai. I'm still trying to, putting these different strands of thoughts together because this is very rich. I think I will take my privilege as a chair to ask the first question. And so I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around this question about, these two realms of consciousness, the realms of consciousness of the master and writer and the consciousness of this lower status people that Zhang Dai and other authors wrote about. You were saying, I am wondering how this, how this perfect surface was created and how that surface was kind of a very hard to penetrate. In Zhang Dai's essay and also in other essays of the late Ming, how was that related to the genre in which the writer writes about? In other words, how is this genre specific? I'm having in mind, the vernacular stories, the classical essay, and also drama. It seems to me that, in drama, especially in some works of Li Yu, I think he's consciously trying to subvert some of the, the kind of perfect surface, the impenetrability that, Zhang Dai and others, and even himself trying to, create in his own essays. Because in dramas, we hear these different kind of voices. We hear them, the literati, but also, the servants, the actors and actresses, prostitutes, even craftsmen. So I wonder, what's your take on that? And also, whether you can, because we're mentioning that this talk is actually part of a longer essay, and it's a longer version. You are trying to recoup some of the identity of the, this lower status people that you were talking about. So whether you can elaborate on that.
I mean, I feel like you are absolutely right that a lot of this is about genre, but I feel like so also in the last few months, I wrote an essay for about Li Yu's play Yi Zhongyuan, which and I think like just thinking about the genre of Chanqi as a whole, where it is a genre that in itself valorizes social and essentializes social distinction. So why, and in fact, characters talk about this sometimes. There's that famous part in Cao Huashan, kind of like, like, why am I a Chou? Like, because you have face paint on. That's why you're a Chou. And, so there's a way in which the genre as a whole rests on the idea of social distinction, so that a Shen and a Den are always elite people, and they always end up together in their proper social position, even if over the course of the play they were in hiding as lower status people. And so, that's the kind of central conceit. But yet you're totally right. Within that, there are all sorts of ways to kind of dig at it. So Yi Zhongyuan, for example, kind of centers the action on lower status people. There is no play where a Chou or a Xiao Dan is not like talking to their boss in a rude way that challenges their boss. So there's obviously within drama this real ability to see things from the perspective of the subaltern and have the subaltern talk back to the boss, even within a larger structure that ends with pushing them down. However, and even Zhang Dai has like, he in one of the essays about his friend Peng Tianxi and Peng Tianxi's wonderful Jiaban, where Peng Tianxi plays Jing and Chou roles. So like the kind of crazy thing is Peng Tianxi was like in full control of his troupe while they're probably acting out, and they had a famously enormous repertoire of like 60 plays that they could put on. So I assume there are all these moments where Peng Tianxi is on stage controlling the other actors while they're pretending to hit him and debase him and demean him, because that's what happens to a Chou on stage. So, like in some ways I feel like the problem, each genre makes a different argument. And you're totally right that Li Yu's argument is often a much more socially nuanced one, both in his plays, but I think even in like 闲情偶记, which is very much a kind of like a different kind of attention to surface in consumerism. Does that answer your question at all? Or is it just a whole, like, a word blizzard?
Oh, it totally makes sense. And also, I think this conversation about Li Yu can be, it can go on forever. But it just reminds me of also Li Yu's another play, 奈何天, in which about the ugly man who marries several women. And this man, I think he was supposed, conventionally he should be a young character, but in that play he was set as a chou. He was cast as a chou character, whereas his servant was cast as a sheng, and doing matchmaking and also taking his place to meet these women. So I think there are small places, small ways in which Li always trying to complicate this issue.
I mean, I think that he is very aware of the social norming that the genre imposes.
Yes. Okay, I think the floor is open to questions. We already have several questions in the box, so I will just ask them in order. So the first question is from Matthew Sommer. Matthew, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Tina. That was great. I already agree with you on everything, so it's not a surprise. But so I've noticed that there is this tendency for scholars now, thinking about topics in the late imperial period, to identify with the elite actor, the elite subject, and it's completely unconscious. So when our women's historians look at polygyny, they identify with the main wife. They never identify with the concubine or the maidservant. When people do legal history, they identify with the magistrate. They don't identify with the clerks and runners, the litigants. And it's a general tendency, and it has an insidious effect, I think. What I'd like to ask you is a very obvious kind of simple question. Why do you think it's so? And can you reflect back on us and our subjectivity, those scholars working now? Why do people looking at Zhang Dai's work always fail to see what you have shown is really so obvious if you just look to see it? Why have so many of these authors and scholars failed to get that? Why have they been seduced into liking what they read when it is so obviously a beautiful facade over a kind of machinery of coercion and exploitation? Thank you. That's my question.
I mean, it's super complicated. I also feel like, like what we end up reading is the sugarcoating. I wish I could see your face, Matt. It is actually kind of like disconcerting to be speaking to the words M. Summer.
Sorry.
I think we learn to read poetry, we learn to read plays, we are taught this language, we are taught these cultural appurtenances. We get all the sugarcoating and we don't get the other part of it, which is why, except that I think there are some texts like Jinping that are the other part of it. But, it may have to do with, unfortunately, our position as university professors as well, where we may not be very good allies to forms of justice that are important. I was, in the longer version of this essay, I cite the translation mistakes that are made by Jonathan Spence in his recent book about Zhang Dai. And every one of them, I first want to say that Taoan mengyi is such hard classical Chinese that I'm sure I have made many translation mistakes in the slides that I have shared. So this is not to slight people making mistakes in Chinese. But his errors are all, they all shift in one way, which is that, so he says, he calls Abao in the Qi Zhixiang's Obsessions a songbird. Abao is a slave boy who sings, who has been transacted to have sex with his friend. I think we want to see, we got this version, we got all the candy without the horrible sugar plantation that made the sugar to make the candy. And I think it's actually kind of responsibility as readers to recognize that insofar as this culture is self-perpetuating, and it is, that, you know, where the candy comes from. I mean, fight on.
We have another question from Rania.
Hi, Tina.
Hi, Rania.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I think I know part of your answer to this, but how do you tie everything you've been talking about to the idea of loss? Because that's the other thing everyone talks about with Zhang Dai. And I think I remember you saying once that his lament for the loss of the Ming is that he doesn't own the people he used to own anymore. So what happens to the master subject position when you've lost a lot of those beautiful things?
It's a great question. So first of all, I am very unsure exactly how poor he ended up. And so that's the mean objective answer, the unsympathetic answer. I think they ended up less rich, but when you were so rich that your family could literally light up a mountain with hand-lit lanterns, less rich might not be that much less rich. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think that the only way that this can be written is under the perspective of the past. So, you know, I think when you're reading Chinese literature, you could almost like start marking every time someone says, "Oh, I'm so poor. I'm poor. I'm not rich." And what you realize is no one is saying they're rich, even people who are obviously so damn rich. You know, like everybody's poor. So poor and rich are rhetorical positions. And to be able to write about the past rich is just giving you license to say what you cannot say about the present rich. So nobody can write about the present like, wow, I am so darn rich. I'm really, really rich. You know, those are words that can't be put together. So I think that's what, you know, I could be a nicer person, but that is actually what the loss says to me. It's an entryway to speaking about wealth.
Okay, thank you, Tina. We have, the third question is from Paul.
Hi, Tina.
Hi.
Yeah, so I kind of want to just move this a little bit away from the sinological discussion and kind of return to your framing devices. This is something that emerged to you out of the 1619 project, and I think that's a really fascinating way to approach this, because I think the whole topic is incredibly interesting. But one of the things I wonder is, are there things that come out of your work on Zhang Dai that could be perhaps useful or interesting to, say, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who did write the 1619 project? Or how would you present this to people who are kind of trying to reframe our thinking about American history? Are there lessons for them in this?
I mean, I feel like they are like too big league for people like me. But really, like, you know, I think that there is this whole early modern culture of coercion and sexual exploitation that is the fundament to our modern world. And I think that's the kind of glorious thing about the 1619 project. I am waiting to see whether, like, sinologists, and maybe especially sinologists from the Chinese speaking world, like, can we get the distance from our materials to actually see that about our materials, that they underlie some really unpalatable mechanics that are in some ways still functioning. I think that we tend to, as Matt said, we tend to identify with the people at the top of the totem pole. But that is this kind of unspoken identification that is everywhere in sinological work. It is, it's in the people who kind of, without very much reflection, talk about Jaban as wonderful opportunities for artistic expression. That, like, how do we get to a point where we actually can clarify our own critical position and see, and not collude? I understand that there is this need to feel like, the wonderful, I think like you, like so many people on this call, reading pre-modern Chinese has been some of the most pleasure I've had in my whole life. But I don't want to have that pleasure without inspecting it.
We have another question from Xiaorong.
Okay, hi, nice meeting you, Professor Lu.
Hi.
Yes, for the first time in person, but by Zoom. Of course, I have known your work and for a long time. I really like your work, and thank you so much for such a fascinating talk, especially for offering such a fresh perspective on familiar materials. So I guess it's very important for us to reflect the politics of taste and aesthetics. So for that, I really thank you. Yeah, very inspirational. I would like to have ask you a question about the ruling class. So Zhang Dai, yeah, I also cite him in my new book. So I really like him as an independent scholar, unofficial class, or a representative of mountain men, posing against the civil service examinations. So in that sense, I'm not sure if we could call him, member of the ruling class. Maybe in cultural taste, yeah. He was a influencer, you could say. And also the slaves were in many occasions, contexts, objects of desire, and they were empowered also. So I would just like you to comment on that. Thank you so much.
So I think when I talk about ruling class, so one thing that I've noticed is that in general, people are deeply aware of the people right above them on a totem pole. Mm. And I think that this goes especially for academics too. I have wasted so much of my life thinking about deans and like hating deans. And I think that we within any hierarchy, it's always your adjacent layers that you see with greatest clarity, and usually the layer right above you. And I would argue that from our perspective, virtually everyone who, Zhang Dai is ruling class in the sense that he is a descendant of a Jingshi and high official, and he's from a family that is so wealthy in Shaoxing and so well known for their wealth. I think that, no, he wasn't an official. Yes, he was a Shannon, but that in some ways is about that kind of microscopic attention to social difference, where someone might say about me, and I would say, oh, but I'm not a dean. I'm totally powerless. I'm just like a normal tenured professor, without seeing that in the scope of like American academe, I have it pretty good. And so like, I think that when you know, because I'm thinking about the YouTube because of the questions that we're following, when you think about like Shen Qing Oji, for example, Li Yu is so clear that he's not rich. No, I'm not rich. I'm so not rich. I'm so poor. But then like the ways that he describes the poor, it's clear that even then they are what we would consider like middle class. You know, like he doesn't give subjectivity or agency to the Lord only knows what percentage of 17th century society that were actually had no disposable income, that actually might have to sell a child to buy food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I feel like, you know, probably ruling class is too blunt an instrument, but I do think that the idea that we imagine pre-modern China and we imagine its pleasures and the people who enjoyed those pleasures, to call that ruling class is probably not that inaccurate. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what about the power that certain enslaved people had? I'm gonna argue that that's almost like, and this is again to draw on the 1619 project, that's almost like reading Reconstruction materials and having sympathy for Southerners who were so upset that all of a sudden they're like these uppity former slaves. You know, I think that the power that they have, so let me just go back to Qi Zhishanpi, the Qi Zhishan's Obsessions, where he writes, Zhang Dai writes about Abao, who his friend Qi Zhishan has purchased to be a sexual partner, and then Qi Zhishan actually runs off with Abao. Abao is not powerful, you know, and it is part of the way of reading and seeing through Qi Zhishan or through Zhang Dai that we would say, oh, but Abao, unlike the Tangtou that are carrying him around, actually has a name. You know, I think that what we are talking about is a society that is so unequal that we can barely conceive of it. And in the scavenger hunt version of this paper, I actually kind of try to go through some of the essays and try to figure out, like, how many people did he drag out to the middle of this lake? Because they're, you know, when they're having wine, somebody's carrying the wood to heat up, to light the fire, to heat the wine. Somebody is bringing along someone cooked the food. There's somebody who's driving the boat. None of whom are named, all of whom are rendered invisible by this surface. And it's very hard for me to see like a Liu Jingting or an Abao as a kind of example of an empowered enslaved person.
What about the case discussed by Sophie Wolf on Jiu Qing and Chen Weisong, you know, the male actor Jiu Qing, kind of as desire male powerful elite?
I mean, so I think like these kind of young male actors are as powerful as you can get as an enslaved person. They're still being transacted.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, it's just like, you know, that in the kind of grand scheme of the way that power is being distributed in that society, that is not a life I'm very glad to, in the kind of like, I'm very glad to have been born into my positionality rather than that one.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have 2 questions and a comment waiting in the box. So Michael suggests that we will let Tina answer these questions, and after that we will wind down the formal Q&A session, but we will still welcome everybody to stay and hang around and talk. So first, Matthew has a comment.
Thank you. Yes, just briefly. This is sort of an obvious thing to point out, but in regard to Paul's question, I think the American analogy to the kind of nostalgia you see in Zhang Dai would be the lost cause mythology about the Old South. This sort of glorification, this nostalgia, celebration of the Old South, which is based on a very explicit denial of the reality of slavery. And if you can imagine, well, I don't know, if Thomas Jefferson in old age had written a poem or an essay about how beautiful Sally Hemings was, and we were all expected to read that and sort of enjoy her beauty as transposed through Jefferson's wonderful prose. That would be sort of like the text that you showed us, I think, Tina. So if there's an American analogy, so in other words, perhaps this would be a strategy for shining that light back on the Chinese context in order to make it more comprehensible to an American student audience. But I think it's kind of an obvious point. Thank you, I'm done.
Tina, would you like to respond?
No, I agree with Matt.
So we have 2 more questions from Ariel and Ling Hang. So we will just let Ariel and Ling Hang ask the questions. So we collect both questions and then Tina can respond. So first, Ariel, go ahead.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Tina. Such a really wonderful and interesting talk. I really appreciate this attention to what you call like the unspoken identification of sinologists with the cultural elite. Often I find this to be not even really unspoken. I mean, it's something that is often articulated or sort of embodied or lived. I see a lot of scholars of late imperial China, and I'm sure I'm not immune from this, essentially cosplaying, right? It's like late imperial elite, right? Like drinking the tea, playing the guzheng, like this sort of aesthetic embodiment of this, incredibly sort of problematic role. And I'm wondering, and I think you kind of talked about this in answers to other questions, this might be a bit repetitive, but do you think it's possible, to get beyond this without a transformation in the modes of academic production? I mean, considering the way that our work is really complicit with effacing the labor of others, right? Is there anything in our own practices that can be like specifically transformed, or is it just sort of like we kind of carve out spaces or moments of introspection or sort of scavenger hunt, that sort of thing? Like, do you see there being a more kind of fundamental transformation in the academy? Yeah.
That is such a great question. I mean, I guess like one of the things is I wonder whether the old mode of academic writing is like how long it is for this earth. It is so hierarchical, and it may not work now. But I also feel like for us, us meaning English language sinologists, there's this whole question of like, how do we make scholarship that is authentic to us and contributes to a world in which 99% of the sinological scholarship is in Chinese? Like, what are we saying that is easier to say in English than it is to say in Chinese? And I think, and I've been writing about this and thinking about this. Clearly, there are ways in which this talk that I just gave would have been very, very hard to articulate in Chinese, that it's much easier to create that distance when that distance is real. And to, I think it's important for us to celebrate that distance and to say like, I would not have fit in a 17th century party except as somebody washing dishes. Like, Lord, how much of my life have I spent washing dishes? But anyway, like, except as someone doing menial work, I would not have fit in. And let me actually embrace that for a moment. Let me not apologize for that. Because I think we still are in this mode of kind of apologizing for that distance. So not a total answer, but I think you're totally right to be thinking about the forms of scholarship too.
Li Hong, are you there?
Are you there, Li Hong?
Yeah.
Hi, Li Hong.
Hi. How are you?
Hi.
Yeah, I really enjoy the talk, and as if I listened to a whole book titled 警示通源. Simple words to alarm, to admonish the world. Yeah. So and it's fascinating and awakening. And my question would be about how to make or animate this dichotomy between master and slave in a Hegelian spirit. Because it seems we kind of lock the two sides up on the opposite poles, and what is wanting is the motion, right? And that is very vital even to readers, to students, to teachers, because we want to get out of this, right? This social bond, right? That traps everybody in a certain position. And so maybe I want to listen to you more about the position of the things, right? That is what your upcoming book, right, is focusing on. And it's not just the aesthetic object appreciated by under the gaze of the master, but it's also the material worked on, right, by the servants. And maybe I want to go back to your reading of that Zhu Gong, right, craftsmen, right, that entry and that in which your reading against the grain says let us know that Zhang Dai is not celebrating the lower people, because he actually condemns them as lowering themselves, right, humiliating themselves, right, 自见, right. And but I would read that same passage as, because it's not a 自见, but it is 之间之人之间之. The object is not selves, themselves, but rather the things. So it's just people, right, of their own accord, or of their own accord, lowers or humiliate the things, right? That means if you don't pay attention, if don't value, if you fail to work on things, then you can never really raise yourself, right? Right. So because things have the potential to raise people, right, to another level, right, socially, especially in this passage. So I wonder if this is a moment of redemption for us to think in this triangle of things, right, servant and master. Actually, that those three things are all in Hegelian discussion, right, of the master and slave dialectics. Masters just consume things, right? The master just consumes things, but the servant actually processes it. So I wonder how will you talk about it?
You know, like, thank you so much for articulating this so well, because I mean, I think in some ways it's kind of implicit in some of the things that I was writing about, that, you know, so when Zhang Dai is writing about these lanterns, he knows that he does not know.
Yes.
You know, like, there's a great sense of knowing what you do not know because you are like separated. And like in one of the other chapters, I write a lot about optical illusions and camera obscura, like the kind of the boxes with the pinhole camera in them. And there's like a huge, there are a bunch of people who are like crafts gong working on creating illusions. And so this whole question of like this engagement with like mechanics and craftsmanship and what the master, the sphere out of which the master excludes himself is very much something that I'm fascinated by. But you're totally right that the kind of the dynamic is actually a kind of a triad. So thank you.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, everybody. I think our time is up for the formal talk, but we will leave the meeting open for people who want to hang around and continue the conversation. So feel free to stay. And thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Yinghui, for moderating. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Thank everyone for the questions. Esther for all the behind the scenes facilitating. And we really appreciate it.